So let us take a trip to the early days of hacking to start with. Now, the Internet Engineering Task Force is responsible for maintaining documentation about protocols and various specifications and processes and procedures regarding anything on the Internet. They have a series of documents called the Request for Comments or the RFCs. And according to RFC 1389, it says a hacker is a person who delights in having an intimate understanding of the internal workings of a system, computers, and computer networks in particular. While the expression hackers may go back a long time and have many different connotations or definitions, as far as computers go, some of the earliest hackers were members of the Tech Model Railroad Club at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And what those people did and the various things that they did and were involved in are detailed in Stephen Levy's book called Hackers for Our Purposes. Now, for our purposes, we'll be talking about other types of hackers. Although the spirit of what we do goes back to those early days, now the definition of hacking or hackers has changed, particularly in the 1980s, and in part as a result of a couple of people, namely Robert T. Morris, who was a Cornell graduate, who unleashed a piece of software that was called a worm on what was an early version of the internet worm, went on to cause a lot of damage and create a lot of downtime on systems across the country and across the world. Now, the Morris worm did end up resulting in something good, however. That is, the Computer Emergency Response Team at Carnegie Mellon was created primarily in response to the Morris worm. Now, there's also Kevin Mitnick, who is another well known hacker who was responsible for various acts of computer crime over a couple of decades. He was the first convicted in 1988. So the definition of hacker or hacking moved from something benign to something far more sinister in popular culture. Now, we see hacking or hackers in all sorts of popular culture. We've seen them in hacker movies called war games, also the movie Hackers. Of course, you also see it in the Matrix movies, where you can see, if you look really closely, that they are using a tool called Nmap, which we will get into the use of in great detail later on as we go on. Now, also the movie Sneakers and the movie Swordfish. And on television, in addition to other places, you can see the agents at NCIS regularly doing things like cracking complex cryptography in just a matter of seconds or minutes. So, what is hacking really? Well, hacking is about a deep understanding of something particularly with relation to computers and computing. It's also about exploring and the joy of learning new things and understanding them very clearly and being able to manipulate those things in ways that maybe other people haven't before. It's also about digging into problems to find out solutions in creative and interesting ways, and sometimes finding problems where there weren't problems previously. And that's a little bit about what is hacking. Okay, so now that we have talked about what exactly is hacking and how the meaning and connotations of that word has changed over time, how it came into existence, how it was coined, let's go over the reasons that people normally hack. Now, you may want to hack just for fun. As discussed previously, hacking is a tradition that goes back several decades at MIT, even preceding the computer related definition of hacking. Now, MIT has a long and storied history of hacking, and sometimes of a computer related nature, which in this case happens to be true, and sometimes of a non computer related nature instance. Now, here you can see that MIT's homepage has been hacked, or you might even say defaced, to indicate that Disney is buying MIT. This was an April Fool's Day prank in 1998, and again, this is just the kind of hacking that you would do for fun rather. Now, sometimes you might want to hack just to prove a political point, or any point for that matter. In this case, again, Bill Gates had donated some money to the MIT, which allowed them to have a new building. And he was coming to MIT to visit and give a talk about Microsoft Windows and its systems. And as you can see, the Windows systems that were installed in the entryway at the building were hacked to be running Linux instead. And you can see here that Tux the Penguin is saying, "Welcome to the William H. Gates building." Again, that's some students who decided that they wanted to make a point about Linux and Microsoft and Windows to Bill Gates, and they thought hacking was the best way to go about it. Sometimes you hack just for the challenge. Here's an example again at MIT, where some students turned the facade of a building into a Tetris game board. Now, this was a reasonably difficult hack, and the students went after it just for the challenge of completing it. And it just so they could have some pride of ownership and to be able to say that they were able to pull this off. You know, the things that teenagers do to show off to other teenagers, it just increases with increase in scale. Now, in spite of its difficulties and its challenges and all the obstacles and planning that had to go into it, they were able to pull it off, and now they have those bragging rights. So that was one of them, and one of the instances where somebody would hack just for the challenge and for the fun in it. Now, sometimes you want to hack to prevent theft, and this is where we get more specifically into computer related hackings. You see a lot of articles and stories in the news over the last few years about cybercrime, and here's an example of data theft compromised. And a fewer than 1.5 million cards for global payments. So there are some attackers who got into this company, Global Payment, and they were able to pull out about 1.5 million credit card numbers during the intrusion there. So what you may want to do is you may want to learn how to hack in order to find these holes in your systems or applications or employer systems so that you can fix these holes and prevent these compromises from happening because of the reputational hit that your company takes whenever things like these happen. You have the risk of completely running out of business. So, just to protect your job, to protect your company, and to protect your own desire of business, you may just want to learn to hack, and that's a very good reason. Now, you may also want to find all the problems that exist in your system before putting them out and deploying them so that you can keep these attackers from getting in and stealing critical or sensitive information. Sometimes you may want to hack to get there before the bad guys. And the same sort of idea is the last one where we're just going to talk about, and that exactly is ethical hacking. Now, we were just talking about how sometimes you may want to hack into your own system before publishing it out to the public. Let's take Internet Explorer for example. Now, Internet Explorer was actually published to the public with some critical error in the code, and these flaws were heavily exploited by people who actually found them. Now, a number of people in the world go out looking for these flaws and they call themselves security researchers and they get in touch with the vendors after they found a flaw or a bug and work with the vendors to get it fixed. What they end up with is a bit of reputation, they get a name for themselves, and that name recognition may end up getting them a job or some speaking engagements or a book deal or any number of ways that you could cash in on some name recognition from finding these sort of bugs and getting them fixed. If you want to get there before the bad guys, you may think you're helping out a vendor, you may want to just make a name for yourself, you may want to find these sort of bugs before the bad guys do because the thing about the bad guys finding them is they don't announce them and they don't get them fixed, and that makes everybody a little less secure. Finally, you may want to protect yourself from hacked computer companies and fight cybercriminals. And this is a new headline from June 18, 2012. And we're starting to see these sort of news headlines show up as companies are starting to retaliate against attackers in order to retaliate against attackers. Now, in order to retaliate against attackers, you need to be able to have the same sort of skills and techniques and knowledge and experience that those attackers have, and where your company may want you to learn to hack, or the company may want to bring in people who are skilled at these sort of activities so that they can attack the attackers, and hopefully you end up with more steely exterior and you get a reputation for not being a company that people want to go after. Those are several reasons, and there we go. I gave you around a bunch of reasons as to why you may want to hack: for fun, to prove a point, to protect yourself, to protect the company, to not run out of business, and along with another bunch of reasons. Okay, so now that we have talked about why you would want to hack, let's move on to the types of hackers that exist. Now, we're going to be talking about the different types of hacking, and the first type of hacking that I want to discuss is ethical hacking and ethical hackers, which is really what we're going to be talking about through the rest of these lessons. Now, an ethical hacker is somebody who thinks like a black hat hacker, or thinks like somebody who's intent on breaking into your systems, but follows a moral compass that's more in line with probably the majority of the population. So, their intent isn't to do bad things. Their intent is to look for bad things and get them fixed so that bad things don't happen. Ethical hackers aren't out to destroy anything, and they're not out to break anything unless it's deemed to be acceptable as a part of the engagement and also necessary in order to demonstrate a particular vulnerability to the organization that they're working with. So that's an ethical hacker, and there's a certification that's available from the EC Council. It's a certified ethical hacker, and if you find certifications valuable and this sort of thing is what you want to do, pursuing a certified ethical hacker may be something you might want to look into. Now, let's talk about black hat hackers. There's plenty of cases of black hat hackers through years, and let's talk about a guy in particular called Kevin Mitnick. This guy right here is a particularly good example, probably because he was a black hat hacker for a lot of his years. His goal was to cause mischief, to steal where necessary, and just to be engaged in the lifestyle of being a hacker and doing whatever was necessary to continue doing whatever he was doing. It crossed moral boundaries or ethical boundaries. And so Kevin Mitnick here was involved for well over a decade in computer crime and was finally picked up by the FBI, and he was charged and prosecuted, and he was eventually convicted of some of the activities that he was involved with. Now, you may be able to argue that Kevin is a gray hat hacker, and a gray hat hacker is somebody who kind of skirts the line between black and white hat hacking. And white hat hacking is really what an ethical hacker is. So instead of saying ethical hacker, you could say white hat hacker. It's the same idea. A white hat hacker is somebody who hacks for good. If you want to think of it like that, if you want to think of it as a good versus evil, and what they're really doing is they're in it for the technical challenge. They're looking to make things better, make things more efficient, improve them in some way. On the other hand, a black hat hacker is out for the money, for the thrill. It's really a criminal activity, and a grey hat hacker is somebody who may employ the tactics and technique of a black hat hacker, but have sort of a white hat focus. In other words, they're going to do things that may be malicious and destructive in nature, but the reason they're doing it is to improve the security posture of an organization that they are working with. So you can see there's actually a book called Grey Hat Hacking. It's a pretty good book, and it details a lot of the tactics and strategies and techniques we'll be going over in subsequent lessons in this video. Now, one other type of hacking that I want to talk about is a thing called hacktivism, and you'll find hacktivism all over the place. And one example in the last year or so, and certainly in recent memory, is called Lulz Security. Yeah, you heard that right. It's called Lulz Security. And you can argue that Lulz is actually a response to another type of hacktivism. An organization called Anonymous started hacking companies like Sony to protest their involvement in a lawsuit regarding a PlayStation 3 hacker. Now, Lulz Security was supposedly protesting the treatment of Anonymous, or was hacking in support of this group, Anonymous. So they hacked a number of companies and did things like pulled information, usernames, and passwords from the databases at these companies. And they said that the reason was to shine a light on the security of these companies, and also theoretically to embarrass the companies with their weak or poor security postures. And the problem with that they were doing this through were posting information that they had found online, and that information often included details about customers for these particular corporations. And for an ethical hacker, a white hat hacker, that would cross the boundary of causing harm. So there's no reason for me as an ethical hacker to post information in a public forum about somebody, because I could be doing damage to them. But in this case, Lulz Security and Anonymous, specifically Lulz Security, were engaged in a form of hacktivism, and what they were doing was not only damaging to the corporation, that certainly was detrimental to those people. So different types of hackers and different types of hacking. We've got ethical or white hat hacking, we've got black hat, grey hat, and then we've finally got hacktivism. It's really the goal and the means that vary from one to the other. Okay, so now that we've discussed the types of hackers, let's also discuss the skills necessary to become one. So what we're going to discuss in this part are the different skills that are required or will be learned as a part of this video. So initially, just for basic computing, you need a basic understanding of operating systems and how to work them. There are going to be several fundamental types of tasks that I won't be going into any detail at all, and you'll need to know how to run programs and do things like open up a command prompt without me walking you through and how to do that. So I am going to assume that you have some basic understanding of how to do these sorts of tasks. Also, you need an understanding of the basic system software, and you'll need a basic understanding of how to use command line utilities. There are a number of tools and programs that we're going to be going through this video, and many of them use the command line. Now, whether it's on Windows or Linux, you'll need to be familiar with typing and being able to run programs from the command line. and the various command line switches and parameters that those programs or types of programs are going to use. Now, from a networking perspective, you need a basic understanding of some simple networking concepts. You need to know what cables are and switches and hubs and how systems are networked together. You don't really need a deep level of understanding. I'll be going through some protocols at a reasonably deep level because I think it's important as an ethical hacker to understand what's going on at the protocol level so that you can know better what you are doing and how to achieve the goals and tasks that you have before you. So we're going to be going over some protocols. So just understanding what protocols are and how they go together, those sort of things are necessary from a networking perspective. Now, we're going to also be learning a bunch of life skills. Yes, there are some life skills that it's important to have. I think the most important one is the ability to accept failure and persevere. And by that, I mean you're going to be just running across several things that just don't work the first time around. And it's going to take a little bit of time and stick to itiveness to plug away and keep going until you get something to work. And the way that you get things to work is having an ability to problem solve. And sometimes solving problems requires being a little creative. Sometimes you need to think out of the box and come at a problem from a different perspective in order to find a solution. Throughout the course of this video, you're going to run across a lot of sticky problems through the course of learning about being an ethical hacker and just doing the work because it's not as simple. So here's a little recipe for how to do this. Now go follow this recipe every time and you're going to be successful. Every situation is different. Every system is different. You're going to run across some pretty sticky problems and you're going to have to just wait and get your hands dirty and keep failing and failing and failing and failing until you find a way to succeed. So I think those skills are very necessary to learn how to be an ethical hacker. Digging through some of the material that we'll be going over in this video, as far as what you're going to be learning, you're going to be learning about how to use a lot of tools. You're going to learn networking, and by that I mean we're going to be talking about different protocols that are involved in networking systems together. You're going to learn about security and security postures. Security is the heart and soul of ethical hacking. It's why we do ethical hacking in order to make systems and networks more secure than they were previously. That's the goal from a networking perspective. We're going to be talking about how to read packets from network captures. We're going to be going into TCP/IP related protocols in a fairly significant amount of detail. And you're going to understand how protocols interact with one another. So we're going to do all that, and the reading packets is going to be really important. And we're going to do a fair amount of that in addition to just a fundamental approach to learning how to read packets in several lessons. We're going to read packets as a way of understanding the different tools that we're using and how they're going to learn tactics and methodologies. And you get to learn to use the information you've gathered in order to get more information. And information is really what is this all about. You can't do much, anything without information. And sometimes it takes a fair bit of digging in order to find that information. And what you're going to learn is the entry points and the stepping stones to get the information that you need. And then once you have that information, you're going to be learning about ways to exploit it in order to get deeper into the target. You're going to learn security awareness. We're going to talk about risk and understanding risks and vulnerabilities. Primarily recognize the difference between a vulnerability and an exploit, and there's a significant difference. There's security awareness and understanding what a risk is and how that impacts your target, and it's going to be key to a lot of things that we talked about. So it sounds like a lot. We're going to cover a fair bit of ground, not all of it at a deep level. Sometimes we're going to skim the surface, but there's an awful lot of material to be covered. So let's get started into talking about the different skills that are required or will be learned as a part of the series of video. So initially, just for basic computing, you need a basic understanding of operating systems. So it sounds like a lot that we're going to cover, and a fair bit of it is going to be at a very deep level, and sometimes we're just going to skip the surface. But there's an awful lot of material to cover, so let's get started. Okay, so that was all about the skills that we're going to develop throughout this video, and that might be necessary for you to become an ethical hacker. Now let's talk about the types of attacks that you might be dealing with as ethical hacker yourself. So now we're going to be talking about the types of attacks. Now, one type of attack that you'll find common, particularly in cases of hacktivism, for example, or cases where people are trying to make a particular point or just be a general pain, is this idea of defacing. Now, defacing goes back for quite a while. It's the idea of sort of digital graffiti where you've left your mark or your imprint behind so that everybody knows you were there. Primarily a website thing, and it's really just making alterations to something that used to be pretty common a long time ago. Now, it's very particular for businesses or people or just organizations in general to have their homepages be replaced by this other thing that was along the lines of, hey, I was here and I took over your web page. We also have a pretty common one, or certainly has been common over the years, and it's a pretty good path towards quality exploits and high profile vulnerabilities, and that's buffer overflow. Now, a buffer overflow is a result of the way programs are stored in memory. When programs are running, they make use of a chunk of memory called a stack. And it's just like a stack of plates when you put a bunch of plates down. When you pull a plate off, you're going to pull the top plate. You're not going to pull the oldest plate, you're going to pull the one that was on top. So the same thing with the stack here. We're accessing memory, and this has to do with the way functions are called in memory. When you call a function, a chunk of memory gets thrown on top of the stack, and that's the chunk of memory that gets accessed. And you've got a piece of data in memory within that stack, and that's called a buffer. And when too much data is sent and tried to put into the buffer, it can overflow. Now, the bounds of the configured area for that particular buffer, it can overflow the bounds of the configured area for that particular buffer. Now, the way stacks are put together, we end up with a part of the stack where the return address from the function is stored. So when you overflow the buffer, you have the ability to potentially override that return. At which point you can control the flow of execution of programs, and if you can control the flow of execution of the program, you can insert code into that memory that could be executed. And that's where we get buffer overflow that turns into exploits that creates the ability to get like a command shell or some other useful thing from the system where the buffer overflow is running. So that's a buffer overflow in short. Sometimes we also have format string attacks, and sometimes these can be precursors to buffer overflow formats. Now, format strings come about because the C programming language makes use of these format strings that determines how data is going to be input or output. So you have a string of characters that define whether the subsequent input or output is going to be an integer, or whether it's going to be a character, or whether it's going to be a string or a floating point, that sort of thing. So you have a format string that defines the input or the output. Now, if a programmer leaves off the format string and just gets lazy and provides only the variable that's going to be output, for example, you have the ability to provide that format string. If you provide that format string, what then happens is the program starts picking the next piece of data off the stack and displays them. Because that way we can start looking at data that's on the stack of the running program just by providing a format string. And if I can look at the data, I may be able to find information like a return address or some other useful piece of information. There is also a possibility of being able to inject data into the stack. I may be able to find some information like a return address or some other useful piece of information. There is also a possibility of being able to inject data into the stack. I may be able to find some information like a return address or some other useful piece of information. There is also a possibility of being able to inject data into the stack using this particular type of attack. Now, moving on to our next type of attack is a denial of service. A denial of service, this is a pretty common one, and you'll hear about this a lot. This is not to be confused though with the one that I'll be talking about after this, and that is a distributed denial of service. So this one that you see this is a denial of service attack. And a denial of service is any attack or action that prevents a service from being available to its legitimate or authorized users. So you hear about a ping flood or a SYN flood, that is basically a SYN packet being sent to your machine constantly, or a Smurf attack. And Smurf attack has to do something with ICMP echo requests and responses using broadcast addresses. That one's been pretty well shut down over the last several years. You can also get a denial of service simply from a malformed packet or a piece of data, where a piece of data is malformed and sent into a program. Now, if the program doesn't handle it correctly, if it crashes, suddenly you're not able to use that program anymore. So therefore, you are denied the service of the program and thus the denial of service. Now, as I said, a denial of service is not to be confused with a distributed denial of service. And I know it's pretty trendy, particularly in the media, to call it any denial of service a DDoS or any denial of service a DDoS. Now, it's important to note that any denial of service is not a DDoS. A DDoS, or as you might know, a distributed denial of service, is a very specific thing. A distributed denial of service is a coordinated denial of service making use of several hosts in several locations. So, if you think about a botnet as an example, a botnet could be used to trigger a distributed denial of service, where I've got a lot of bots that I'm controlling from a remote location, and I'm using all these bots to do something like sending a lot of data to a particular server. When I've got a lot of systems sending even small amounts of data, all of that data can overwhelm the server that I'm sending it to. So, the idea behind a distributed denial of service attack is to overwhelm resources on a particular server in order to cause that server not to be able to respond. Now, the first known DDoS attack used a tool called Stockholrot, which is German for barbed wire. Now, Stockholrot came out of some work that a guy by the name of Mixter was doing in 1999. He wrote a proof of concept piece of code called TFN, which was the Tribe Flood Network. Let me just show that for you. So you can see on the Wikipedia page that the Triflood Network, or TFN, is a set of computer programs that is used to conduct various DDoS attacks such as ICMP floods, SYN floods, UDP floods, and Smurf attacks. Now, I know many people don't really consider Wikipedia a really good source of any sort of knowledge, but it's a good place to start off. So, if you want to read about all these types of attacks like ICMP floods and what exactly is a SYN flood, you can always do that from Wikipedia. It's not that bad place. Of course, you shouldn't use Wikipedia as your final Rosetta Stone. Moving on. So this program called OldRod, it was used to attack servers like eBay and Yahoo back in February of 2000. So that attack in February of 2000 was really the first known distributed denial of service attack, which is not to say that there weren't denial of service attacks previously. So to that, there were certainly plenty of them, but they were not distributed. Now, this means there weren't a lot of systems used to coordinate and create a denial of service condition, and therefore we get the distributed denial of service attack. So that's a handful of type of attacks and some pretty common attacks that you're going to see as an ethical hacker when you become an ethical hacker, or if you're trying to become an ethical hacker, you should always know about these types of attacks.